All right, so in the last video, we learned what is I. I was the square root of -1. We did a little bit of work with it. Our video right now is going to focus on more what to do with I. What other things can I help us with? So you've got some spaces to write these in. We can add. We already did that. We can subtract with complex numbers. We did that. And we are about to learn how to multiply complex numbers. Simplifying expressions, we've done that. And we're going to learn how to find imaginary roots when we solve equations. It's going to take a second to write in the list of things. That'll be good for you to reference, like, what's the point? Why do I work with I? How do I work with I? When is this going to show up? Any of these things is where it could show up. So, as a reminder, the imaginary I is equal to the square root of -1. So when we square I, we get rid of the square root and we're right back to -1. Here's another little joke for you. Imaginary friends, me and my unicorn. All right, so I to the third. Well, if I think about this, I to the third is the same thing as I squared times I. Well, I squared was -1, and then I we just write as I. So I to the third is the same thing as -I. I to the fourth is going to be I squared times I squared, which is -1 times -1, and a negative times a negative will always make a positive. So something that's interesting about I is the way that it repeats this pattern. Okay, so I, -1, I, 1. I, -1, I, 1. I, -1, I, 1. And it's going to repeat over and over. Even if you had I to the 600th power, you could figure out what it is just by knowing these 4 powers. It's part of our abstract algebra and figuring out how these things repeat. Okay, nothing you need to worry about really in here, but you should be aware of these 4, that didn't write anything, these 4 facts. And so I say them in the way that you should try to remember them. I, -1, I, 1. You kind of say it as a little chant in your head. All right, so let's use it. We're going to see where that shows up. We are on to the multiply part of working with I. So to multiply, we're going to treat these, remember, just like we did with like terms from Algebra 1. So I'm going to start and I'm going to distribute. And I end up with -24i plus 4i squared. Well, I'm supposed to write my answer in standard form, which means I'm supposed to have my 1 part real and 1 part imaginary. The -24i is definitely going to be my imaginary part because I is there. But here I end up with I squared. And if you remember from the previous slide and from the earlier video, I squared is the same thing as -1. So I can rewrite this as plus 4 times -1. Well, what's 4 times -1? -4. You are correct. So that becomes my real part. Let's try it again. This one I have a binomial, 2 terms, times a binomial, 2 terms. I have a complex times a complex. This one I just had an imaginary times a complex. So I'm going to do 9 times -4 gets me -36. I'm going to do my outside. 9 times 7 gets me 63, and I had an I. -2 times -4 gets me positive 8i. And then -2 times 7 is going to give me -14. I times I gets me I squared. Okay, so let's combine like terms. -36, that's the only one of those I have. These both came back as imaginaries. So 63 plus 8 is going to be 71i. And then this one, I again run into this I squared. Well, I squared is the same thing as -1. So what's a -14 times a -1? You're right, it's positive 14. So now I've got 2 reals that I can collect. -36 plus 14 is going to give me -22 plus 71i. So I came back with a complex number, 1 part real, 1 part imaginary. All right, it's your turn to try. Write your final answer in standard form. Go ahead and pause the video. Try these two. A reminder that when you get to the I squared, you're going to need to replace that with -1. Pause your video. All right, go ahead and check your answers. I've shown all of my steps. When that I squared comes up, I boxed it in red and replaced it with a -1, okay? Because I squared is always equal to -1. Both of these came back with complex answers, 1 part real and 1 part imaginary. Okay, take a second to look it over if you need to. Make sure that we get to the same answers. Pause your video if you need to, but otherwise we're going to move on. All right, this is kind of an interesting way that your book likes to ask some questions. It's a way to kind of think more about the real part versus the imaginary part of a complex number. So it says, find the values of x and y that satisfy the equation. Well, here's my x, and here's y. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. But if you notice, I have 1 part real, 1 part imaginary on the left, and I have 1 part real, 1 part imaginary on the right. Well, in order for these two complex numbers to be balanced, the real part would have to be equal to the real part. And the imaginary part would have to be equal to the imaginary part. Well, let's go ahead and solve then. This one, I'm just going to divide by 2 to get x by itself. So I end up with x is equal to 5. That helped me with my real part. This one, I want to get y by itself, so I need to divide by I, the imaginary square root of -1. Those are going to cancel, those are going to cancel, and -7 is equal to y. So again, I took the real part and the real part from each complex number and set them equal. I took the imaginary part and the imaginary part and set them equal. You know what time it is. Time for you to try. So remember, think real and real. Think imaginary and imaginary. So real and real, real and real, imaginary, 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 imaginary. Go ahead and do each of these and figure out what x is equal to and what y is equal to. You can write these down here as a little reminder for what you're looking for. Go ahead and pause the video. Try these. All right, so I set my reals equal to my reals, my imaginaries equal to my imaginaries, and this is what I came up with. So in this step, just to show you a little bit, I divided by I, and then here I divided by -1. In this guy, I divided by -3. In this one, I first divided by I to get those away. Then I divided by 4. Okay, just to show you kind of the steps for how I got there once I solved those equations. But your final answers are down here, x equals and y equals. All right, last thing, solving with roots that lead to complex numbers, or complex answers rather. So what we are looking for here is to solve these equations using square roots, because all of these just have a squared term. We don't have that. We have ax squared. We have c. We don't have the bx part. So these are all candidates for using square roots in order to solve them. So I'm going to help you get started with the first 2, and then you're going to try the last 4 on your own. So it says, use the definition of the imaginary unit I, well, we know that I is equal to the square root of -1, to match each quadratic equation with its solution. So all the solutions are over here. And with movie editing magic, I realized that all of our solutions should have had those plus and minuses. That was my fault from cutting and pasting. Yours already do. But we're going to go through, we're going to solve each one of these. So I'm going to go ahead and say x squared is equal to 4. When I take the square root, I'm going to get that x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2. So that's going to be answer F. This next one, I'm going to say that x squared is equal to -4. So when I take the square root, I'm going to get x equals plus or minus the square root of -4. Well, if I think about -4, that could break down into -1 times 4. So this will become I times 2. in which case I have plus or minus 2i, which is going to be answer D. Okay, go ahead and try and solve each one of these 4 that are remaining. Pause the video, come back and check your answers. Go ahead and pause now. All right, go ahead and look at your answers. Should match each one. I've got some colors going on so you can try to see that. But when you take the square root of the negative, right, that's where that I starts to show up because the square root of -1 is equal to I. All right, so let's talk real quick about the checklist. I can perform operations with complex numbers. So operations is basically the concept of working well with them. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, kind of understanding what they are, etc. Can you define the imaginary unit I? Yes, you can. It's equal to the square root of -1. Can you do things with I to the 4th? You can. Remember, I, -1, I, 1. And so this is I squared, I to the 3rd, I to the 4th. Can you write complex numbers? Did that. Can you add, subtract, and multiply? Did those. Solve quadratic equations by directly solving. That's what we just did. And we had real and imaginary answers. The completing the square and quadratic formula we'll get to sometime next week. We're just not quite there yet with our unit. But these 2 videos covered the rest of the standards that you need to know, okay, for this section for understanding complex numbers and how to work with them, okay? Once you're done with this, there should be some extra practice for you to try. Make sure that you really have a good handle on this and are fluent with working with your imaginary answers, I.